Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, I wanted to paint a watercolor snowy landscape, but see if I could paint it in only 5 simple steps. Sometimes we paint landscapes and they're just too complicated, so let's see how simple we can make this beautiful piece. First, we're going to put down a light sketch. Don't worry, we're not really sketching anything. We're just getting the idea of where we want our mountain peaks and where we want the hills in our landscape. Don't fret too much over this. This is just to give us a guide and an idea. Very, very light sketch so that we can paint over it. Now you might be thinking that even if this is simplified, you're not going to be able to paint the mountains, but I promise if you use this kind of side swiping technique, it makes it kind of foolproof. So we're using a light blue color, and with it kind of dry, we are going to side swipe our brush, and this is the first step. So if you want to look at a reference picture, you totally can, but we're going to focus a lot of this side swiping blue stroke on the left side of the mountain as if there's some light source coming from the right side casting a shadow. So we want a lot of this side swiping brush stroke to get a lot of nice beautiful texture so that everything is really broken up, but we do want some areas that combine, come together, have different odd weird shapes and are a little bit more blended. You don't want it to be too uniform, and you want to make sure you're leaving enough white space so that it looks like there are big patches of snow that the light source is hitting. If you feel like you're not getting that textured stroke very easily, you might be using too much water or your paper might not be textured enough. So try playing around with different types of paper, but also remember to keep a rag nearby so that you can tap off some of your water and pigment to get a drier consistency so that you'll get more of that open textured stroke with the paper shining through. So you can see we're not filling in all of the gaps. We're leaving a lot of white space because we are going to add some of those details that fill in the rest of the mountains later. But the next step is actually adding dark blue contrast. And I like to do this while it is still wet so I can tap into those lighter blue areas and get a nice gradual bleed. So that first lighter blue color was a cerulean blue, and then this darker color is a little bit of indigo mixed with my cerulean in a higher concentration, higher pigment. So we are focusing this in the shadowy areas on the left, and I'm also using the tip of my brush to kind of create some lines and edges where some of our peaks and shapes in our mountain needed to be a little bit more defined. And then here I bounced back to step 1 to get a little bit of a lighter blend to create some more dimension in the mountain, and then back to step 2, adding in the darker pigment for contrast. This is a lot darker with this very strong indigo, so I'm just tapping it in lightly in some of the other areas. Having the lighter blue, the mid-tone blue, and then the really dark indigo blue for the final bit of contrast really helps create a lot of dimension even when the painting is so simple and loose. You don't need a lot of detail because the colors are kind of telling the story without needing help from the details. When I do these tutorials of very simplified paintings, and I'm trying to do them in a 5-step process, I want to do as much of the painting in one go as possible. So after we finish these mountains, we're not going to come back to them. So that's why I want to make sure I get all of my colors, depth, contrast, and everything in while it's still wet so that I can move on and not come back to it. Moving on to step 3, trees. So having some tall trees over here to the left is really going to help frame in our mountains. So very quickly, I started with my Polina Bright size 0 round brush, and it wasn't giving me the shape that I wanted for these pine trees. So I moved to my long round size 4, which I'm obsessed with, especially for pine trees. So the trick with pine trees is to just flick the brush out on either side, bringing it in, bringing it out, making sure there are branches in the middle, and tapering everything from a pointy top to a wider bottom, and keeping some white space so you can see the branches in between. If you don't feel like you're good at trees, this is something that you can practice so easily on any scratch piece of paper that you can find. I feel like it took me a long time in my watercolor journey to get good at painting pine trees, and now I feel like they just kind of flow out of me. So you'll find your groove, this becomes a lot more simple. But I'm just keeping the paint that I'm using very simple, just using sap green and painting two trees. One is a little bit taller, one is a little bit shorter, and a little bit closer to us. Kind of goes a little bit closer down to the bottom of the paper. And this frames in the mountains over here on the left side really, really well. And the way that I switch it up and make some kind of contrast is by doing lighter areas of sap green with more water, and then just going in with a darker pigment of sap green. But I just wanted to keep it really simple, no lighter areas and no difference in color. It's all just sap green, just with some water added and some a little bit more pigmented. And since we are keeping these trees simplified, we're not going to come back to them, so we want to make sure we're getting all of our colors and contrasts and textures and little bits in the trees in this first go. The next step is snow shadows. Now, snow shadows are really important because it's going to continue to tell the story of where the light source is coming from. We started telling that story on the mountains, keeping some of the areas on the right side of the mountains more bright white. And then we continue the flow of the story by adding the shadows on the left side of the trees as well. I'm using a very light wash of cerulean to use for the shadows in the snow because I feel like it gives it a nice light glow that looks like snow to me. And I'm going to be using that same light wash of cerulean to define our hills of snow as well. And I'm using that same quick side stroke we used for the mountains at the beginning, just keeping it really rough and uneven. I don't want it to be too perfect. I want it to look like lumpy, bumpy hills of snow. And then while that is still wet, I'm very quickly picking up my sap green and just painting some very quick lines. This is in real time. Painting some quick lines for trees. So I'm still counting this as the step for trees, and we are just going to paint just a tiny bit of shape and texture into them. And again, this is all in real time. I wanted to do this really quickly because I wanted these trees to kind of blend into the snow while it was still wet and give it lots of depth and interest. My biggest tip for when you're painting something that's super simplified and only a few steps, the more you can lean into the wet on wet beauty of watercolor, the more interesting and vibrant it will look and not so flat. Step number 5 is adding a sky. Now there's so many different ways you could do this. You could do a colorful sky. You could really do your sky before you did any of this, but sometimes I just like adding the sky at the end because, as you can see, I'm doing a very light cerulean. I don't want it to compete with the other blues I have in my painting, but I keep adding paint and water. But what I'm doing is I'm kind of outlining the edges of my mountain and defining where some of those snowy edges that kind of were left open and blank are. So it's kind of fun to be able to use the sky, especially when you're painting snow-capped mountains, to define and kind of trace around where the edges are. And I'm not even mixing this blue on my palette, as you can see. I'm just dipping it straight into my paint and then dipping my brush into water and then kind of mixing it and moving it on my paper. I'm doing this because you can see my palette is a mess, which is fine. I'm a very chaotic painter, but I don't want any other blues or pinks or yellows to get into the mixture, and then my sky will be green or purple or whatever. I just want it to be a nice, crisp, clean blue. So my favorite way to do that is almost mixing my water and my pigment on my paper instead of mixing it on my palette. And I just keep manipulating it while it's still wet until I am happy with it so that I can then move on to the next part. So technically we have all 5 of our steps here, but I felt like something was missing in the lower corner, and I decided to add a few more trees, which is still, right, part of our tree step. I'm not doing anything outside of the steps. I just maybe bounced around in the steps a little bit. And these trees are just going to balance everything out. They're going to be a little bit smaller and grouped together, give us a little bit more perspective on where everything is. So I almost added a rock, but that wasn't really going to fit into the steps. I would have had to add, 6, 7, 8 steps to include rocks. But we have big giant mountain rocks in the background, and we'll just add a few more trees, and then to make sure those trees actually look like the other trees, we're going to add shadows as well. And really, the whole point in showing you a simplified landscape and trying to do it in 5 steps is to show you that landscapes don't have to be complicated. And I know my last landscape that I posted was really fun in its complexity. It had a lot of elements to it, but sometimes it's nice to just paint something really simple and be very proud of how good it looks. And it's really fun to do that with snowy landscapes because you don't have to do a whole lot to the ground because it's just covered in white snow, which is perfect when you have white paper. Also, sometimes I think it's hard to balance what I want to paint and how far I want to push myself, and also remembering that I'm still teaching all of you. So if you could let me know in the comments below what kind of tutorials you're looking for. Are you looking for super basic things, more intermediate? Are you wanting to be challenged? I feel like this tutorial was a good balance of keeping it really simple, showing you the basic steps, but also probably challenging you a little bit with that mountain and maybe helping you stretch and get better with your pine trees, but keeping the composition and the overall steps to achieve something beautiful really simple. So after we add these shadows, we're technically done. I mean, we could have been done before we added these trees. I just feel like they really completed the whole painting. But there is an optional 6th step of adding snow splatter if you have white gouache or bleed proof white, and if you just want to add a little something to this painting. Honestly, I feel like at the end it barely adds anything. It's just a little fun extra detail to add texture and interest. So definitely don't feel like you have to add this, but I mean, why not? I'm splattering everything. If you haven't noticed in most of my videos, my desk is just covered in splattery flecks. I actually cleaned it for this tutorial, so I hope you feel very special. But yeah, just a little bit of a touch of snow in the air, and this painting is completed. Thank you so much for being here today with me while we painted this little snowy, simplified watercolor landscape, all of the titles. I really enjoy the challenge of trying to make something as simple as possible, and I hope that we accomplished that today, that you learned something, and that you're able to create your own beautiful piece from what you have learned here today. I will see you all next time.